going to begin pretty much from the beginning. This first section, I'm going to be talking about the Olmecs. In the second, I'll be concentrating more on the Mayans. Now, of course, the first people who came into the Americas were those hunter-gatherer groups who came over from Siberia during the Ice Age. There's a little bit of evidence that's getting more and more clear that there were already people living in the Americas at that time, but that's still not quite as solid. Now, that said, the first Ice Age hunters spread through the Americas. They pretty much wipe out all the big game. And while they're doing so, they expand. There doesn't seem to have been a huge number of them in that first wave, but the population grows and grows and grows. Anyway, between 7,000 and 5,000 BC, we get the first farming cultures in the Americas. So, where in the Americas? In Mesoamerica. What do I mean by Mesoamerica? I mean Middle America. It's basically southern Mexico, northern Central America. The southern half of Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, El Salvador, sometimes parts of Nicaragua. And this landscape is one, it's much more wet than the region immediately north of it, and is one that divides fairly easily between lowland and highland sections. The lowlands tend to be wet, very hot, a lot of jungle, especially as you go eastward. The highlands tend to be somewhat drier, as well as cooler. And again, as you go westward, somewhat northward, things get drier before when you get to northern half of Mexico, where you're getting into quite arid landscapes. The Pacific coast being much more arid than the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico coast. Now, that said, Mesoamerica is a region where one of the core regions where the Neolithic Revolution happens. There, instead of wheat or millet or rice, the most important single crop will be corn or maize. And it will provide the overwhelming majority of calories for later people in Mesoamerica and elsewhere. And what's kind of interesting about corn is if you look at wheat easily resembles grass. Wild grass grows up into something looking a lot like wheat if you don't cut it. Wheat looks like grass, and it's not a mystery. Finding the wild corn is quite a lot harder. For one thing, the corn we grow, if you were to leave it abandoned in the field, it will not grow back. It cannot self-seed. It can only grow by human planting. If you look at its wild ancestor, teosinte, you can see it there on the left-hand side, it only bears the slightest resemblance to the corn that we know. Not only does it look fairly, basically nothing like the plant that it's descended from it also is genetically very, very different. I mean, of all the domesticated crops, this is definitely the greatest leap between the wild and the cultivated version. Now, corn does not give you anything like complete nutrition. However, if eaten in combination with beans and squash, um, those three being the trinity of Mesoamerican crops, you get most of the nutrients you need. Add some tomatoes, some chilies, and you start having actually a basically balanced and full diet, especially if you bleach your corn. It's called nixtamalization, soaking it in lye, turning it into hominy. You get a complete diet. And these crops are all domesticated in southern Mexico. There are a number of other crops that come along as well, like chocolate. This is chocolate as it looks in its native state. Vanilla, pineapples, strawberries, cotton, chicle, of which we make the basic ingredient in chewing gum, rubber, tobacco, avocados, and then some things that are maybe a little more surprising, like agave and prickly pear. We don't really eat those in North America, but they're both cactuses. Prickly pear is one you see growing a lot around here. Agave is used for making mezcal and tequila. Now, the typical Mesoamerican farm is going to look something like this. Made for someone coming from the European, Middle Eastern, African, Asian farming traditions, it looks fairly messy. It's called a milpa, and there are at least a dozen different cultivated plants all growing in the same field. They work together to provide the food that humans need, the vitamins, all of the amino acids. They also work together. So, for instance, the corn stalks provide the bean vine something to grow on, and so on and so forth. You know, you can stake the tomatoes to the corn. It all works very successfully and provides a very high yield farming system, one of the most successful in the world. It does take quite a while for this to expand out of southern Mexico. Corn and most of these other crops will make it down into South America about 5,000 years ago. It is more recent that they come into what's now the US, partially because the big difference is we have winters, and many of the crops, including corn, had to be adapted successfully to grow in what's now the United States. Once they did, they allowed a massive increase in the Native American population. And of course, later, after European and African settlement began, a lot of these crops will be adopted. And quite a lot of them are things that, you know, we eat every day, even now. Now, this intensive sort of farming begins on the east coast of Mexico, right at the southern part of the Gulf of Mexico, in what's now Tabasco State. The area question is also today one of the major oil producing areas in Mexico and the world. Now, these are generally swampy lowlands. There are a number of rivers, as you see elsewhere, though no great river valley that defines the region. Anyway, in one of these river zones, the Coatzacoalcos River, large population centers start to grow up after about 1600 BC. And here there will emerge some of the first cities in the Americas. This is at a place called San Lorenzo. That's the modern name, obviously. And these cities and the cultures that develop around them will share a lot of the aspects of urban civilization that we have seen elsewhere in the world. They will also not just have things in common with other civilizations at a similar stage of development, but they will also set the stage for most of the developments in Mesoamerica over the next 3,000 years, and for areas beyond that core region. The people who are doing this are usually called the Olmecs. And the Olmecs probably didn't call themselves that. This is what a later group that we usually call the Aztecs, who spoke a language called Nahuatl, still a spoken language, called them Olmecas, meaning the rubber people, as in their time, that is the Aztecs' time, their region was the main source of rubber. Now, these Olmecs, but we'll continue to use that name because we don't know what they called themselves, these Olmecs did have writing. By 900 BC, they are using a writing system that sometimes called hieroglyphics. And we see not just examples of their writing carved on stones, but there are even some pictures that they make that seem to show people reading books, like actual books, like the ones we know. So it seems pretty likely that while we only have a few examples of writing from this period, it was probably much more common than the evidence would suggest. This is one of those things. If most of their writing was on a plant-based, whether wood or leaf type material, cotton, cloth, whatever, in the swampy, jungle-like areas that they lived, it would not have survived anywhere too close to the present. Their writing system seems to have spread out to other peoples in what are now Mexico and Central America. Within about 400 years, the Zapotecs, people living in the modern state of Oaxaca in Mexico, are using a writing system that seems to be related. A couple centuries after that, the Mayans are also writing, and both of those writing systems seem to be derived from the Olmec system. So this is definitely something they share in common with most of the other ancient civilizations. Now, while Olmec has not yet been cracked, the writing system that is developed from it, that is the Mayan hieroglyphics, have been. It uses about 700 different symbols. Here you can see some of them. There are about 7,000 inscriptions in 4 complete Mayan books. We know there were a lot more Mayan books when the Spanish arrived in Mexico. The Spanish Dominicans who went out in the area where the Mayans lived burned as many books as they could because they believed they would encourage the local people to worship their old gods who they considered to be demonic. Now, Mayan writing only got fully deciphered in about 1986-87, so it's only in the last 34 years that we really see full understanding of Mayan texts, and so what we know about the Mayans has changed. The Olmecs have not yet been cracked. It may just be a period of time. We shall see. Now, because we cannot read their writings, it's really hard to say exactly how Olmec society is going to be organized. But we can see from their surviving artwork that men in fancy clothes, holding weapons and looking menacing, seem to be in charge. And based on what we know from similar cultures around the world, we can guess that these are probably their kings. We also have a very unusual group of sculpture. These giant Olmec heads, ranging from about 4 feet to 11 feet high, with human heads wearing helmets. None of them are the same. They seem to be some sort of individuals who are being represented, as opposed to, say, a common god. But while presumably they're kings, we just can't say. Now, one of the things that we can definitely see that is developed by the Olmecs is something I think a lot of us may actually be familiar with. Now, the Olmecs were seen later as living in the land of rubber. And one of the things they seem to have invented were rubber balls, using the latex from rubber trees, making round balls, and using balls that bounced. They have a game, and it seems to have been created by the Olmecs. The Mesoamerican ball game, as it's sometimes called, is played in a court space smaller than one of our gymnasiums, about the size of a squash court, and it has 2 rings on either end through which the ball must be put to win. The players wear protective gear. Some people think this has a religious value rather than being purely sport. Personally, think it's maybe something of a combination, just like with the Greek Olympics. And you see people playing the game. And here we see a man wearing his protective gear with the ball. And to get an idea of how important this is, basically every ancient town found throughout Mexico and Central America has at least one ball court that can be clearly identified. It is a game that spreads into some of the pre-European cultures of North America and appears to be played there, or rather variants of it. It's not the same game everywhere, but it's the same basic idea. We have even a couple of sculptures like this one. Here, you see people lined up on either side of the ball court watching the game happening. Now, the influence this has had on world culture is really, really tremendous. First off, any game that uses rubber balls comes from this game. That would include, obviously, basketball, but also baseball, where, it's got a rubber core, anything like that. And there's a really interesting thing. If you look across Africa, Europe, and Asia in the time before Christopher Columbus, they have sports. The Greeks have sports. The Romans have sports. The Mesopotamians, the Egyptians, the medieval Europeans, so on and so forth. But they don't play games like this, where you have a ball court and a ball. A defined field for playing the game, and with organized team sports. It seems like, well, where do some of those games we're familiar with first start up? Start up in coastal European countries, according to the standard version, right around 1500. Which is really interesting because it seems like even if they did not bring the Mesoamerican ball game, they brought the idea of ball games from the Americas. More direct versions of this will give rise to highlight, lacrosse, which is a Native American game, the Canadian version, and ultimately field hockey, and then ice hockey. And ice hockey, if you look at the basic rules, is the sideways ancestor of basketball, played with a rubber ball. So in a lot of ways, this is the ancestor of the NBA 4,000 years ago. Anyway, I just think that's very interesting. Other things the Olmecs do that will leave a really long impact is they develop the first calendar. This will be adopted by the Mayans. The Mayans will pass it on to other people as well. And the way that the calendars are done is really, really unusual because they're basically three different ways of counting and finding the date. There is a 365 Hab year, a 260-day Sulcan year, and these run at the same time. Takes 52 years, or 18,980 days, for them to come back in sync. So if you know what day it is in both of these, you don't even need to know how many cycles have gone by. It's very easy to fix dates when people in Mesoamerica leave them. There is also a third system called the long count that counts the total number of days that have gone by since the 11th of August, 3114 BC. Why that date, what its significance is, don't really know. But the fact it's so early suggests that might have been something significant to the Olmecs. Now, the Mesoamerican people also developed some really highly developed mathematics, some of the most highly developed mathematics anywhere in the world. And the way they do it is quite interesting. Rather than a base 10 system, they use base 20, so 10 fingers, 10 toes. Here are their numerals, which are pretty darn easy to understand what they represent. They have a 0, as well as place value. They are the first people anywhere in the world to have a concept of a 0 and to use place value. It will be invented again in India, but it is a separate invention. Now, we also know a little bit about their religion. Seems like the Olmecs do a lot of rituals that involve bloodletting. Both, the person who is praying using their own blood and the blood of others. Their worshippers in Mesoamerican religions will have themselves tortured. There is pretty good evidence of human sacrifice, also of child sacrifice. For the Olmecs, it's not as clear as for later on because we do not have full writing. Certainly, later on in Mesoamerican societies, human sacrifice is really, really important to religious practice. Now, the Olmecs will have a tremendous influence on the civilizations that will grow up in Mexico and Central America in later centuries. And a lot of the things they lay out will come back and continue on through the Mayans, the Aztecs, the two best known, but also groups that maybe we don't hear quite as much about, the Zapotecs and the Toltecs, the Zacatecs, so on and so forth. But they all basically go back to the Olmecs. And thank you. I will continue in later with the thing about the Mayans.